The crystal glasses of the Sterling family dinner party chimed with a sound like fracturing ice. Seated at the head of the polished mahogany table was Eleanor Vance, her hands resting protectively on the gentle swell of her 7-month pregnancy. Her husband Donovan rose to his feet, a triumphant, reckless gleam in his eyes. He raised his glass not to his expectant wife, but to the room at large. A toast, he announced, his voice carrying a chilling authority, to my real family. The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. A stunned silence fell, but before the first gasp could be drawn, Eleanor calmly stood, the rustle of paper in her hand the only sound. "In that case, Donovan," she said, her voice impossibly steady, "I think it's the perfect time to read my will." The Savannah air on that late August evening was a heavy, wet blanket, thick with the scent of magnolias and the promise of a storm that refused to break. Inside the Sterling ancestral home on Forsyth Park, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the combined heat of 20 bodies and simmering resentment. To an outsider, it was a picture of Southern aristocracy perfected. To Eleanor Vance, it was the final suffocating act of a play she had been forced to perform for 3 excruciating years. The dining room was Donovan's domain, a testament to the Sterling legacy. Dark, heavy wood oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and a chandelier that dripped crystals like frozen tears. Every piece of silver on the table was engraved with the ostentatious S that her husband and his family wore like a brand. Eleanor, by contrast, was a Vance. Her family's wealth was older, quieter, rooted in New England shipping, and built on principles not just profit. She had met Donovan during a semester abroad at Oxford, swept away by his easy charm and the romantic narrative he spun of a modern Southern gentleman. He was handsome, ambitious, and radiated a confidence that she often lost in books and quiet contemplation found intoxicating. The reality of their marriage, however, had been a slow, creeping disillusionment. The charm was a veneer for a deep-seated arrogance. The ambition was a rapacious hunger for more money, more influence, more validation. And the Southern gentlemanly code was a convenient shield for a startling lack of empathy. Tonight was the annual Sterling Foundation benefit dinner, a night where Donovan played the grand benefactor, schmoozing with the city's elite. He had insisted on hosting it at their home this year, a power play to solidify his position as the heir apparent to his father's real estate empire. Seated around the table was a carefully curated cast of characters. At the opposite end, Richard and Margaret Sterling held court. Richard was a bulldog of a man, his face perpetually flushed, his eyes constantly assessing the value of everything and everyone in the room. Margaret was his silent, immaculately preserved partner. She was a woman sculpted from porcelain, and disdain her smiles thin, and her compliments laced with subtle barbs. From the moment Eleanor had been introduced, Margaret had treated her not as a daughter-in-law, but as a temporary custodian of the Sterling bloodline. The pregnancy had only slightly softened her, and even then her interest was purely dynastic. A boy, of course, she had stated, not asked, when Eleanor announced her pregnancy. The Sterling name must continue. Next to Margaret sat Donovan's younger sister Penelope, a nervous, flighty woman who communicated primarily through anxious giggles and fiddling with her pearl necklace. Her husband, a perpetually browbeaten man named Gregory, simply nodded along to whatever the elder Sterling said. Eleanor's sole ally at the table was Sophia Rayner, her friend from college who was visiting from New York. Sophia was a sharp, witty lawyer with eyes that missed nothing. She had flown down under the guise of helping Eleanor prepare for the baby, but in truth, she was there as a lifeline. Sophia had distrusted Donovan from the start. "He looks at you like he just acquired a priceless piece of art," she had warned years ago. "He doesn't see you, Ellie. He sees a beautiful frame for his own reflection." Also present were Donovan's business partner, Benjamin Carter, and his wife. Ben was a decent man, but weak-willed, easily swayed by Donovan's stronger personality. He reaped the benefits of Donovan's aggressive tactics and so rarely questioned them. The dinner conversation was a stilted ballet of feigned pleasantries and veiled boasts. Richard Sterling pontificated about a new waterfront development while Donovan interjected with figures and projections, his voice loud and self-assured. Margaret would occasionally offer a perfectly timed anecdote about a European vacation or a rare art acquisition, subtly reminding everyone of their station. Eleanor felt a kick from inside her womb, a tiny, insistent flutter. She placed a hand on her belly, a gesture that was both protective and grounding. This child, her child, was the only thing that felt real in this house of illusions. It was for this child that she had started making plans, contingency plans that had grown more detailed and more urgent with each passing week. For months, a cold knot of suspicion had been tightening in her gut. It started with small things. The late nights at the office that stretched until 3 a.m., the scent of a perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his suit jackets. The second phone, the one he called his work phone, that was password protected and never left his sight. When she had gently questioned him, he had deployed his most potent weapon, gaslighting. "Stressed, Ellie. The pregnancy is making you paranoid," he would say, his tone dripping with condescending concern. "You know the pressure I'm under. I'm building this empire for us, for our son." He would frame her valid questions as emotional instability, a symptom of her condition. Her concerns were dismissed as hormonal fantasies. But Eleanor was a Vance. Her quiet nature was mistaken for weakness, but beneath it lay a core of analytical steel. Her grandfather, a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of international trade, had taught her one crucial lesson: trust your gut, but always, always verify. So she had verified. 2 months ago, she had contacted a discreet private investigator in Atlanta, a man highly recommended by her family's attorneys. His name was Arthur Gable, a former FBI agent with a quiet, methodical approach. The initial findings had been like a physical blow. The late nights weren't at the office. They were in a sleek, modern apartment in a new downtown high-rise. The second phone was a dedicated line of communication. The perfume belonged to a woman named Katrina Hayes. The weekly reports from Mr. Gable had become her secret, painful ritual. She would read them in the privacy of her study, her hands shaking as she looked at the grainy photographs, the timelines of assignations, the copies of expensive gifts bought on a credit card she didn't know existed. Donovan wasn't just having a casual affair. He was living a double life. The discovery had been devastating, but it had also been clarifying. The fog of her marriage had lifted, revealing the rotten foundation beneath. The man she had married didn't exist. He was a construct, a lie she had been sold, and had for a time desperately wanted to believe. The love she thought they shared was a transaction, and her pregnancy, she now realized, was merely the closing clause on his acquisition of the Vance family's connections and eventual inheritance. She knew she couldn't confront him directly. He would lie, twist her words, and paint her as the hysterical pregnant wife. The Sterling family would close ranks around him, protecting their own and ostracizing her. She would be trapped legally and financially entangled fighting for custody of her own child against a powerful, manipulative family. No, that would not be her fate, or her child's. So with the cold precision she had inherited from her grandfather, she began to prepare. Guided by Sophia and a team of the best lawyers her family's money could hire, she had spent the last 6 weeks constructing her escape. It wasn't just a divorce filing, it was a fortress. The centerpiece of that fortress was a new, ironclad last will and testament. It was a morbid thought for a pregnant woman in her late 20s, but her lawyers had assured her it was the most powerful tool she had. A will, they explained, was a declaration of intent that, while meant for after death, could speak volumes in the present. It could be used to define assets, clarify inheritances, and in this case serve as an undeniable, legally binding statement of fact. Tonight, as she listened to the hollow laughter and watched Donovan soak in the adoration of his sycophants, she felt the final vestiges of her old life falling away. He was so confident in his deception, so certain of his control. He believed her to be the docile, unsuspecting wife, the perfect incubator for his heir. He had no idea that the woman across the table was no longer his victim, but his judge and jury. The main course plates were cleared away, replaced with dessert and glasses of champagne. For Eleanor, a glass of sparkling cider was poured. Donovan, his face flushed with wine and self-importance, tapped his glass with a spoon. A hush fell over the room. He stood, his 6-foot frame seeming to dominate the space, his smile wide and predatory. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice smooth as velvet. "Tonight is about legacy, about building something that lasts. And in that spirit, I want to propose a toast." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, deliberately skipping over Eleanor. He looked at his mother, who gave him a small, conspiratorial nod. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw Sophia's eyes narrow, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "There are the families we are born into," Donovan continued, his voice taking on a tone of profound false sincerity. "And then there are the families we choose. The people who see us for who we truly are, who support our true selves without judgment. The ones who form our real foundation." He raised his glass higher, his gaze now directed somewhere beyond the walls of the room to a life she was never meant to see. "So I want to raise a glass," he declared, his voice ringing with triumph. "Not just to the Sterling Foundation, but to my real family. You know who you are. This is for you." The silence that followed Donovan's toast was not a respectful one. It was a void, a vacuum that sucked the air and warmth from the room. The clinking of 20 glasses being set down sounded like a volley of small arms fire. Guests exchanged confused, uncomfortable glances. Penelope Sterling let out a tiny, choked giggle that died in her throat. Her husband Gregory stared intently at his dessert fork, as if it held the secrets of the universe. Benjamin Carter, Donovan's business partner, had the decency to look mortified, his cheeks flushing a deep mottled red. Richard Sterling's face was a thundercloud. He wasn't upset by the sentiment Eleanor knew, but by the sheer recklessness of the public display. This was a breach of protocol, an unforced error in the carefully managed game of public perception. But it was Margaret's reaction that truly chilled Eleanor to the bone. There was no surprise in her mother-in-law's eyes, only a flicker of smug satisfaction, a silent affirmation. She had known. Of course, she had known. Margaret, the high priestess of the Sterling dynasty, had been a willing accomplice to her son's betrayal, all to ensure the family's carefully constructed image remained untarnished. The affair The deceit. It was all acceptable as long as it was kept quiet. Donovan's mistake wasn't the infidelity. It was his ego, his need to allude to it, in a room full of their peers. Eleanor felt as if she were watching the scene from a great distance. The ornate dining room, the faces of the guests, the triumphant smirk on her husband's face, it all seemed like a tableau from a nightmare. The baby inside her gave a sudden, violent kick, a sharp jab to her ribs, as if it too could feel the seismic shift in their world. The kick jolted her back into her body, the distant roar in her ears resolving into the frantic beating of her own heart. For a fleeting second, the pain was so immense, so all-consuming that she thought she might shatter. This wasn't just a toast, it was a public execution. He had, in front of their friends, his family, and the pillars of their community declared her and their unborn child to be a sham. He had nullified their marriage, their life together, their future, with a few carefully chosen, devastatingly cruel words. He was celebrating his secret life, rubbing her nose in her own irrelevance. Her first instinct was to scream, to sob, to throw her glass of cider in his handsome, treacherous face. She wanted to expose him for the liar and the cheat that he was. But as she looked at him standing there, soaking in the confusion he had wrought, something else took over, a cold, crystalline rage. It was a fury so pure and so potent that it burned away the pain, leaving behind a terrifying calm. He had underestimated her. They all had. They saw the quiet, gentle Eleanor and assumed she was fragile. They had mistaken her kindness for weakness, her patience for ignorance. They had no idea that for the past 67 days she had been preparing for this exact moment. Not this specific toast, no, but for the moment the war would move from the shadows into the light. She felt Sophia's hand briefly touch her arm under the table, a silent offering of support. Eleanor gave a barely perceptible squeeze, back a signal that said, "I'm okay. Watch this." With a composure that felt otherworldly, Eleanor placed her napkin neatly on the table. She reached down for the elegant leather handbag at her feet, the one Donovan had bought her for their anniversary, a meaningless bauble she now knew. Her fingers, steady and sure, closed around a thick folded sheaf of papers. It was a crisp, notarized copy of the document her lawyer had finalized just last week. Slowly, she pushed her chair back. The sound of its legs scraping against the polished hardwood floor was unnervingly loud in the tense silence. Every eye in the room swiveled to her. Donovan, who had just taken a triumphant sip of his champagne, lowered his glass, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He expected tears, a scene, a retreat upstairs in shame. He did not expect this. Eleanor stood to her full height, one hand still resting on her pregnant belly, the other holding the folded document. She was no longer just the wounded wife. She was a woman about to reclaim her life. "That was a beautiful sentiment, Donovan," she said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to every corner of the room without a single tremor. The sound of her own steadiness surprised and empowered her. Donovan's smug expression faltered, replaced by a wary confusion. "Eleanor, sit down. Don't make a scene." "A scene?" she repeated, a small, humorless smile touching her lips. "I think you already took care of that. But you're right. Your toast does call for a response. It's about legacy, you said. About one's real family. It seems you've been doing a lot of estate planning in your head. I've just been a bit more practical about it." She unfolded the papers in her hand. The heading was visible to anyone who cared to look. "Last Will and Testament of Eleanor Vance." A collective gasp went through the room. It was a sound of shock, of morbid curiosity, of scandal unfolding in real time. Richard Sterling's face went from thunderous to apoplectic. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, girl?" he boomed. Margaret's porcelain mask finally cracked her eyes wide with disbelief and fury. "Eleanor, this is wildly inappropriate. You are hysterical." "On the contrary, Margaret," Eleanor replied, her gaze locking with her mother-in-law's. "I have never been more clear-headed in my life. My husband raised a toast to his real family. It seems only fitting that I ensure my own legacy and that of my child is protected from any ambiguity." She looked directly at Donovan, whose face had drained of all color. The triumphant conqueror was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. "So, if you'll all indulge me," Eleanor announced to the spellbound room, "I'd like to read you a few key passages. Think of it as a companion piece to my husband's lovely speech. After all, what could be more real than a last will and testament?" The room was utterly still, the air thick with the promise of detonation. Eleanor drew a deep breath, looked down at the first page, and began to read. Eleanor's voice, practiced and calm from years of quiet reading, filled the cavernous dining room. It was not the voice of a hysterical pregnant woman. It was the voice of a CEO announcing a hostile takeover. "This document," she began, her eyes scanning the top of the page, "is the last will and testament of Eleanor Catherine Vance, executed on the 22nd of August 2025. It revokes any and all prior wills and codicils." She paused, letting the legal finality of the words sink in. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces, before landing once more on her husband. Donovan stood frozen, his champagne glass still in hand, his knuckles white. He looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath his feet was a trapdoor. "Let's skip the preamble and get to the heart of the matter," Eleanor continued, turning to the second page. "Article 1, Definition of Terms." Her voice was methodical, almost academic. "For the purposes of this, will the term, 'my child,' shall refer to the child I am currently carrying, due in November of this year, and any subsequent children born to me. The term, 'my husband,' shall refer to Donovan Alistair Sterling, for as long as he remains my legally wedded spouse." She took a breath. "And the term, 'my estate,' shall encompass all assets, properties, and holdings derived from the Vance Family Trust, my personal inheritance, all properties and accounts held in my name, and my 50% spousal share of any and all marital assets accumulated during my marriage to Donovan Alistair Sterling." Richard Sterling made a sputtering noise, half standing from his chair. "Your 50% share, that's our family's money." "Actually," Richard, Eleanor said without looking at him, "the bulk of our marital assets, including the down payment on this very house, was funded by a gift from my father upon our wedding, a fact I have meticulously documented." She returned to the will, her finger tracing the next line. "Now, for Article 2, Primary Beneficiary." She raised her voice slightly. "Upon my death, the entirety of my estate, without exception, shall be placed into a specially created trust, to be known as the Vance Progeny Trust. The sole beneficiary of this trust shall be my child as previously defined. The trust will be administered by 2 trustees, my dear friend Sophia Rayner, a licensed attorney in the state of New York, and my father William Vance." A wave of murmurs rippled through the guests. She had not only created a trust, but had appointed her fiercely loyal, legally sharp friend and her powerful father as its guardians. She had built a financial wall around her child. Sophia sat perfectly still, her expression grimly satisfied. She had helped draft this very clause. "Now," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a lower, more deliberate register, "we come to the most relevant section for tonight's toast. Article 3 Exclusions and Disinheritance." She looked directly at Donovan, her eyes devoid of any emotion but a cold, hard finality. The room held its breath. Article 3.1, I hereby expressly and intentionally disinherit my husband, Donovan Alistair Sterling. He shall take nothing from my estate, neither from my personal holdings, nor from my share of our marital property. This is not an oversight. It is my explicit wish and command. Donovan finally broke his paralysis. "Eleanor, this is insane. It's a joke. You can't be serious." "I have never been more serious in my life," she retorted, not missing a beat. "But don't worry, Donovan. I've provided a reason. A will is so much more effective when it provides context for the probate court. Allow me to continue." She cleared her throat and read on. Article 3.2, this decision to disinherit my husband is based on conclusive evidence of a sustained and duplicitous extramarital affair conducted by him. This affair has diverted significant marital assets for the maintenance of a parallel life, a life which he, by his own admission, moments ago, considers his real family. The guests gasped. This was no longer subtext. It was a public indictment. "This parallel life," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength, "is centered around one Ms. Katrina Hayes, residing at apartment 2401 at the Orion Tower on Abercorn Street. Marital funds were used for her rent-her-car lease, a white BMW 4 Series, for those who are curious, and numerous other expenses, all detailed in Appendix A of this document, which includes bank statements, credit card records, and a summary of findings from a private investigator, Mr. Arthur Gable." She paused and looked up, letting the name of the woman and her address hang in the air like poison gas. Benjamin Carter's wife stared at her husband with wide, accusing eyes. The Orion Tower was one of the Sterling Carter Group's newest, most exclusive developments. Ben looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "But it's more than just an affair, isn't it, Donovan?" Eleanor's voice softened into something sharp and dangerous. "A real family often implies more than just a mistress." She turned the page. Article 3.3. This disinheritance is further solidified by the existence of Donovan Sterling's unacknowledged issue. Specifically, his son, Caleb Hayes, born 18 months ago to Ms. Katrina Hayes. My husband has been providing financial support for this child using our shared marital funds, a fact he has deliberately and maliciously concealed from me. If the previous revelations were a bomb, this was the fallout. The room erupted. Penelope shrieked and burst into tears. Richard Sterling was on his feet, his face purple with rage, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. "You lie. This is slander. We'll sue you into oblivion." "Everything I have stated is legally verifiable, Richard," Eleanor said, calmly holding up the thick document. Mr. Gable was very thorough. He even procured a copy of the birth certificate. The father's name is listed as Donovan Alistair Sterling. She then turned her iciest gaze upon her mother-in-law. "And lest there be any doubt about who knew what, I'll read one final clause. Article 3.4. Let it be known that my mother-in-law, Margaret Sterling, has been aware of her son's affair and the existence of her other grandchild since at least April of this year. Evidence of their correspondence and shared meetings is included in Appendix B." Margaret Sterling let out a sound like a wounded animal. All her poise, her aristocratic grace, shattered in an instant. She stared at Eleanor with pure, unadulterated hatred. The betrayal was now complete and absolute. She hadn't just been a silent accomplice, she had been an active participant in the deceit. Eleanor slowly folded the papers. Her work was done. She had not raised her voice. She had not shed a tear. She had simply read the facts. She had used their own tools, legacy inheritance, and legal documents to dismantle their world. She looked at the man she had once loved. Donovan's face was a mask of shock, humiliation, and dawning terror. He was no longer the master of the universe. He was just a man exposed and stripped bare in front of everyone he had sought to impress. His real family toast had not been a declaration of his freedom, but the trigger for his own destruction. "So Donovan," Eleanor said, her voice now quiet, but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "Happy now you toasted your real family, and I have just ensured that they are the only family you have left to provide for, with your own money, if you can find any." With that, she placed the will back into her handbag, snapped it shut, and turned to her friend. "Sophia, I think I'm ready to go home now." The immediate aftermath of Eleanor's declaration was pure chaos, a stark contrast to the cold, controlled demolition she had just executed. As Sophia stood and moved to Eleanor's side, putting a protective arm around her shoulders, the Sterling family finally erupted. "You will not leave this house," Richard roared, his face contorted with fury. He took a step towards Eleanor, his bulk menacing. "You think you can come in here, destroy my family, and just walk away?" Before he could take another step, Benjamin Carter, pale and sweating, was on his feet, grabbing Richard's arm. "Richard, don't! For God's sake, think about what you're doing." For once, Ben's instinct for self-preservation had overridden his deference to the Sterlings. An assault on a pregnant woman in a room full of witnesses would be the final nail in their collective coffin. Donovan, finally snapping out of his stupor, lunged not at Eleanor, but at the table, his hands sweeping a swath of crystal and china to the floor. The crash was deafening. "This is all lies. She's a vindictive crazy." He couldn't seem to find the right word, his vocabulary of manipulation failing him for the first time. "She's making it all up." "Am I Donovan?" Eleanor's voice cut through his rage like a shard of glass. "Do you want me to distribute copies? I have them in the car. Appendix A is particularly illuminating. The photos of you and Katrina at the resort in Hilton Head are quite clear. You remember the weekend you were supposedly at a development conference in Atlanta?" Donovan froze, his chest heaving. The specificity of her knowledge was more damning than any outburst. He stared at her, and for the first time, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. The fear of a man who has lost complete control. Margaret Sterling, her face a ghastly white, had risen from her chair and was now approaching Eleanor, her hands outstretched in a parody of supplication. The disdain was gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked attempt at emotional blackmail. "Eleanor, my dear, please," she began, her voice trembling. "Think of the baby, our grandchild. We can sort this out, privately, as a family. There's no need for all this." Sophia stepped in front of Eleanor, a human shield of tailored silk and legal fury. "Don't you dare speak to her, Margaret." Sophia hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You lost the right to call yourself family when you conspired with your son to betray a pregnant woman. You knew, and you smiled in her face at brunch every Sunday. You are despicable." Margaret recoiled as if struck. The other guests, who had been frozen in a state of horrified fascination, began to stir. This was no longer a dinner party. It was a disaster zone, and they were all desperate to escape the blast radius. There were murmured excuses, the scraping of chairs, the quiet gathering of purses and jackets. No one made eye contact with the Sterlings. Social contagion was a powerful force in Savannah, and the Sterlings had just become profoundly toxic. "Get out!" Richard bellowed at the fleeing guests. "All of you, get out!" His authority was gone. He was just a big, loud man in a ruined dining room. Eleanor, shielded by Sophia, began to walk towards the grand foyer. Each step felt like a mile, but her legs were steady. She did not look back. "You won't get a dime," Donovan screamed after her, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'll fight you on everything. You'll be tied up in court for years. You'll have that baby with nothing." At the doorway, Eleanor paused. She turned not to look at Donovan, but to deliver one final devastating blow. "You seem to be confused, Donovan," she said, her tone almost pitying. "You're thinking of a divorce, and yes, we will have one of those. But this," she patted her handbag, "is my will. It's about my assets, the Vance assets. The money you were so desperate to get your hands on, the money you thought you had secured with a wedding ring and a pregnancy." She let the silence hang for a moment. "As for your legal threats, feel free to try. But my lawyers are not the local Savannah firm you keep on retainer to handle zoning disputes. My lawyers are from the firm that handles the Vance Family Trust. They eat men like you for breakfast, while you're trying to figure out how to unfreeze the joint accounts, which, by the way, were frozen at 5 p.m. This afternoon, they will be filing injunctions against every asset you have, pending a full forensic audit, to reclaim every dollar you stole from me to fund your real family." The color drained completely from Donovan's face. The joint accounts. He hadn't even considered that. The operational funds, the payroll for his side projects, his personal liquidity, it was all tied up in those accounts. She hadn't just declared war. She had launched a preemptive nuclear strike. "You can't do that," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I can," Eleanor replied, "and I have. You built your house of cards with my money and my family's name, Donovan. All I did was pull out the foundation." With that, she turned and walked out of the heavy oak doors, leaving the Sterling legacy in ashes behind her. Sophia followed closely, her hand a steady presence on Eleanor's back. They stepped out into the humid Savannah night. The threatened storm had finally broken. Rain was lashing down, washing the city clean. It felt like a baptism. As Sophia guided her to the waiting car, not Eleanor's familiar sedan, but a discreet black SUV driven by a security professional hired by Sophia Liena, finally allowed herself to feel the tremors. Her legs began to shake, and a deep, shuddering breath escaped her lips. The adrenaline that had sustained her was beginning to fade, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. She had done it. She had survived. Inside the car, the world was quiet and safe. The rain drummed on the roof, a soothing, steady rhythm. Sophia handed her a bottle of water. "You were magnificent," Sophia said, softly, her voice filled with awe. "Absolutely terrifyingly magnificent." Eleanor took a sip of water, her hand trembling. "I just wanted him to stop," she whispered, the first tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. "I just wanted the lies to stop." "Well," Sophia said, watching the grand lit-up facade of the Sterling house recede in the rearview mirror, where frantic silhouettes still moved behind the curtains. "I think it's safe to say the lies have stopped." Inside that house, the shouting had just begun. Richard was on the phone, bellowing at his own lawyer, who was undoubtedly telling him just how catastrophic the situation was. Margaret had collapsed into a dining chair, her sobs dry and racking. And Donovan stood amidst the wreckage of his dinner party, his life staring at the empty doorway, through which his wife and his future had just irrevocably vanished. He had made a toast to his real family, and in doing so had become a pariah to the only world that had ever mattered to him. The cost of his secret life was a price he had never imagined he would have to pay. 1 week later, the storm that had broken over Savannah had passed, leaving behind a city scrubbed clean and a sky of brilliant, unapologetic blue. Eleanor sat in a sun-drenched conference room on the top floor of a skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. The view was panoramic, a vista of glass and steel that felt a world away from the oppressive, moss-draped confines of her former life. This was the main office of Knight and Vance, her father's legal counsel. The firm had no connection to her, its name a coincidence that she now found wryly appropriate. She was, in fact, a Knight in her own story, and she was most definitely a Vance. Across the polished table sat Eleanor's legal team. At the head was Alistair Finch, a senior partner in his late 60s, with piercing blue eyes and a reputation for being the most feared litigator in the state of Georgia. He had been the Vance family's bulldog for 40 years. Beside him were two younger razor-sharp associates and a forensic accountant named Maria, whose quiet demeanor belied a terrifying proficiency with numbers. Sophia was there too, having extended her stay indefinitely, acting as both friend and legal liaison. The atmosphere was not one of crisis, but of calm, strategic execution. Spread across the table were not just legal documents, but the building blocks of Eleanor's new life. The injunctions are holding, Alistair began, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. Donovan Sterling and his father have filed 3 emergency motions to have the asset freeze lifted. All 3 were denied. The judge agreed that your evidence of financial malfeasance was compelling enough to warrant a full audit before any assets are released. Maria, the accountant, spoke up. We've already uncovered the primary mechanism of the fraud, Eleanor. Donovan was using inflated appraisals on Sterling Carter properties to secure loans far exceeding their actual value. The excess liquidity from these loans was then funneled through a series of shell LLCs. One of those LLCs, KH Enterprises, was used to purchase Ms. Hayes's apartment and pay for her expenses. He wasn't just using marital funds, he was committing bank fraud. Eleanor absorbed the information, a grim satisfaction settling within her. It was worse than she had thought. Her will had been the detonator, but the real explosive was Donovan's own criminality. What does this mean for him? Eleanor asked. It means, Alistair said, a thin, cold smile on his lips, that his problems are just beginning. We've compiled a preliminary report. We can present this to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Given the amounts involved, they will be very interested. Bank fraud carries a potential federal prison sentence. Up to 30 years, though, he'd likely get less. Prison. The word hung in the air. A part of her, the small part that still remembered the charming man at Oxford, felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a profound sadness for the sheer waste of it all. But it was quickly extinguished by the thought of her child. This was about protection, not vengeance. And Benjamin Carter, she asked, did he know? His signature is on several of the loan applications, Maria said, tapping a folder. His legal exposure is significant. Our recommendation is to approach him, offer him a deal, his full cooperation and testimony against Donovan in exchange for us not naming him in the initial criminal complaint. He'll likely face regulatory fines and lose his real estate license, but he could avoid prosecution. He'll take the deal, Sophia predicted. Ben Carter's only loyalty is to himself. Eleanor nodded. Do it. The past week had been a blur of logistics and legal maneuvers. She had not returned to the house in Savannah. The security professional who drove her away that night had taken her to a private suite at the Four Seasons in Atlanta that Sophia had pre-booked. Within 2 days, a moving company supervised by Sophia and a representative from Alistair's firm had discreetly and legally removed all of Eleanor's personal belongings from the Savannah house. Her clothes, her books, her art, the furniture that had belonged to her grandmother, everything that was hers, was now either in storage or in the new, beautifully furnished 3-bedroom apartment her father had insisted on securing for her in a high-security building in Buckhead. She hadn't spoken to Donovan or his parents. They had tried to reach her, of course, a barrage of texts and voicemails. Donovan's messages had cycled through rage threats, feigned remorse, and pathetic pleas. "Think about our baby Ellie, our son. He needs his father." Margaret's messages were the most insidious, filled with appeals to decency and warnings of public shame. "You are dragging the mother of my grandchild through the mud. Is this the legacy you want for your child? A broken, bitter family." Eleanor had listened to them once with Sophia by her side, then had her number changed. She forwarded the recordings to Alistair's office, where they were transcribed and added to the growing mountain of evidence against the Sterlings. Her life was now a bubble of quiet efficiency. Prenatal appointments with a new top-rated OB/GYN, meetings with financial planners to disentangle her estate completely from the Sterling name, long walks in the park with Sophia, talking about everything and nothing. And in the evenings, she would sit in the nursery of her new apartment, a room painted a soft, calming shade of celadon, and read to her belly. She was discovering a strength she never knew she possessed. The humiliation of that night had burned away her naivete, cauterizing the wound. She had thought Donovan's betrayal was her shame, but she now understood it was his and his alone. By bringing it into the light, she had reclaimed the narrative. The news had, of course, rippled through the Savannah elite. The story, as pieced together by the dinner guests, was that the golden boy, Donovan Sterling, had been caught in a massive scandal, and his quiet, wealthy wife had lowered the boom on him in the most public way imaginable. She was not the victim in their stories. She was the victor. Her father, William Vance, had flown in from Boston 2 days after the dinner. He was a man of few words, his love expressed not through effusive emotion, but through decisive action. He had hugged her tightly, looked her in the eye, and said, "I am proud of you. Now let's make sure he can never touch you or your child again." He had met with Alistair Finch, given him an unlimited budget, and then returned to Boston, confident that the matter was in the best possible hands. The final piece of business in the conference room was the divorce petition. Alistair slid the document in front of her. "It's ready. We're filing on the grounds of adultery and fraud. We're petitioning for full custody with supervised visitation for him at your sole discretion, contingent on psychological evaluation and the resolution of his legal entanglements. We are not asking for alimony. You don't need it, and it simplifies the proceedings. We are simply taking back what is yours." Eleanor picked up the pen. Her hand was perfectly steady. For 3 years, she had signed her name as Eleanor Sterling. It had always felt like a costume. Now, as she signed Eleanor Catherine Vance on the petition that would formally end her marriage, it felt like coming home. "File it," she said, sliding the paper back across the table. As the meeting concluded, Sophia walked with her to the elevators. "How are you feeling?" Sophia asked, her gaze gentle. "Really?" Eleanor looked out the vast window at the sprawling city below. It was a landscape of possibility. "I feel quiet," she said after a moment. "The noise is gone, The constant anxiety, the feeling of walking on eggshells, the gaslighting. It's all gone. It's just quiet. She placed a hand on her belly, and I can finally feel her move without a knot of dread in my stomach. Her, Sophia smiled. I have a feeling, Eleanor said, a genuine, unburdened smile, gracing her own lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. I have a feeling it's a girl. She was building a new foundation, not on the tainted soil of the Sterling legacy, but on the bedrock of her own strength, her own name. The future was no longer a terrifying unknown. It was a blank page, and she was the one holding the pen. 2 weeks later, the final confrontation happened, not in a courtroom or a lawyer's office, but on a neutral public ground of Eleanor's choosing. Donovan had become desperate. The asset freeze had crippled his business. His partners were distancing themselves, his lines of credit were suspended, and Benjamin Carter had officially flipped, providing a sworn affidavit to Eleanor's legal team in exchange for leniency. The U.S. Attorney's Office had opened a formal investigation. The walls were not just closing in, they had crumbled on top of him. He had started circumventing the lawyers, leaving increasingly frantic messages with Eleanor's father, her old college friends, anyone he could think of. He wanted to see her, to talk things through. Alistair Finch had advised against it, but Eleanor insisted. She needed this one final face-to-face closure. She needed him to see that the woman he had married was gone, and the woman who remained held all the cards. She agreed to meet him at the Atlanta Botanical Garden. It was a public space, serene and sprawling, impossible to make a scene in without looking like a lunatic. She chose a bench in the Rose Garden, a place of breathtaking, orderly beauty. She arrived with Sophia, but asked her friend to wait by the garden's entrance, wanting to do this last part alone. He arrived 10 minutes late, a deliberate, petty power move that had lost all its potency. He looked terrible. The tailored suit and confident swagger were gone, replaced by rumpled clothes, dark circles under his eyes, and a haunted, hunted expression. He had lost weight. The city's golden boy was tarnished beyond recognition. He stood before her, his hands shoved awkwardly in his pockets. "Eleanor, Donovan," she replied, her tone neutral. She didn't stand. She remained seated on the bench, the picture of calm, her hands resting on her now very prominent baby bump. "You look well," he said. It was a weak opening. "I am," she said. "I'm sleeping through the night for the first time in years." The barb hit its mark. He flinched. "Look, Ellie, I know I messed up. I know I hurt you." "You didn't mess up, Donovan," she corrected him calmly. "Messing up is forgetting to take out the trash. You constructed a secret life based on lies and funded by theft. You publicly humiliated your pregnant wife. You have to be more precise with your language." He winced, his frustration mounting. "Okay, fine, I did all that, but it was complicated. You don't understand." "Oh, I understand completely," she said, finally looking up at him. "I understand that you married me for the Vance name and the Vance money. I understand that you saw me as a beautiful, quiet, and most importantly, pliable asset. I understand that you needed an heir from a good family to cement your own legacy while keeping your real family on the side. The only thing you miscalculated was my intelligence." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his desperation palpable. "What do you want, Eleanor? Is this about revenge? Do you want to see me in jail?" "This isn't about revenge," she said, and it was the truth. "This is about consequences. You built a world on deceit, and it collapsed. That's not my fault. It's gravity. And the baby, he pleaded, his voice cracking. This was his last card. What about our child? Are you going to keep him from me? Raise him to hate me? Her, Eleanor said firmly. It's a girl, and I won't have to raise her to hate you, Donovan. I will simply raise her to know the truth. I will raise her to be strong and to be a good judge of character. I will teach her to never ever let a man define her worth. He finally broke. His anger gave way to a pathetic, pleading whimper. Please, Ellie, don't do this. Don't send me to prison. My parents, my father's health, the company is ruined. Everything is gone. Yes, she agreed. It is. He stared at her, waiting for a lifeline, an olive branch, a flicker of the old Eleanor he could manipulate. He found nothing. There was a way out for you, she said softly, delivering the coup de grace. A small one. My lawyers drafted a settlement offer last week. You would have had to sign over all rights to the Sterling Carter assets, plead guilty to lesser charges, and agree to our custody terms. You would have avoided prison and been left with, well, with nothing. But you would have been free. A settlement? I never saw a settlement offer, he said, confused. I know, Eleanor said. We sent it to your father's lawyer. Richard rejected it on your behalf without consulting you. He wrote back that the Sterlings do not negotiate with terrorists. He was so blinded by his own arrogance and pride that he doomed you. He'd rather see his son in prison than admit defeat to me. So you see, Donovan, your real family, has failed you yet again. The finality of it hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face a mask of utter despair. He had been betrayed not only by his own actions, but by the very patriarchal pride he had always emulated. His father had sacrificed him to save his own ego. Eleanor stood up slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate. It's over, Donovan. My lawyers will be in touch with yours about visitation protocols after the baby is born and after your sentencing. That is, if you still want to be involved. She looked at him one last time, at the shell of the man who had caused her so much pain. She felt nothing. No anger, no love, no pity, just a vast, liberating indifference. Goodbye, Donovan, she said, and then she turned and walked away through the roses, not looking back. She walked toward the garden entrance where Sophia was waiting. She walked toward her car, toward her quiet apartment, toward the daughter she would soon hold in her arms. She had walked into her marriage as Eleanor Vance and been remade into Mrs. Sterling. Then, in one fiery night, she had been forced to become something else entirely, a warrior. Now, walking away from the wreckage, she was finally simply Eleanor again, free, whole, and standing on a foundation of her own making, ready to build a legacy not of wealth or status, but of resilience, truth, and unbreakable love for the child she had saved. That night, Eleanor Vance didn't just reclaim her life, she redefined what it means to be strong. She turned a moment of profound humiliation into an act of ultimate empowerment. Her story isn't just about a husband's betrayal, but about a woman's refusal to be a victim in her own life. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand up, speak your truth, and tear down a world built on lies to make way for a future built on integrity. What would you have done in Eleanor's shoes? Who do you think was the greater villain, the cheating husband, Donovan, or his enabling mother, Margaret? This story shows that the quietest people often have the most formidable strength. If Eleanor's journey from a gilded cage to absolute freedom resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story of strength and justice. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will have you on the edge of your seat. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for listening.